Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today's video, we're looking at the running back rankings for week 13 of the fantasy season. These are must start and sit players at the position for this week. We'll go through the top 30, mention some players that are left out as well. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed, like the video, and as always, comment down below with any players you're considering starting or sitting this week. Happy to help out. But again, these rankings are going to help you. So if there's any players you're comparing at like wide receiver and running back, that's where I can help. But if you're asking which running back you should start between two, the rankings are going to help you do that. So make sure you're watching the full video, going through all the rankings and some players that I left out. And of course, go check out our friends over at Betfred. If you sign up, bet $50, you're going to win. You're going to get $250 worth of free bets to play with at Betfred. That link is down below the description. Go sign up at the Betfred Sportsbook. An awesome, awesome offer to get your account started there. So let's get to the top 6 of the position, starting with my number 1 guy this week, Josh Jacobs, going up against my Chargers. It is going to be another week where the Chargers continue to get run on. Obviously, being a Chargers fan, I'm constantly reading up on all news, notes, anything interesting from the team, post-game stuff. Very, very involved, and found a stat that is absolutely embarrassing. They're allowing 5.53 yards per designed rushing attempt. That ranks 734th out of 734 teams since 2000, and the data only goes back to 2000, so it could be even worse than that. Josh Jacobs, after a massive week, is in for another massive week. It's a very much a run-first offense. Could be a competitive game, will be a competitive game here, and I like Jacobs a ton this week. At 2, Nick Chubb, going against the Houston Texans. The Texans, 32nd in fantasy points allowed to running backs. Even in the return of Deshaun Watson, there's a clear advantage for this Browns team, and it's on the ground. I expect them to go to that plenty here with Chubb in Deshaun Watson's first game, as they probably potentially ease him back, but still could be explosive on the passing game too. At 3, Austin Eckler. Eckler has been a touchdown machine lately, a reception machine. Doesn't even need to run efficiently whatsoever, but the Raiders could give them that chance. They're 23rd in rushing DVOA, 26th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. As long as Mike Williams is out, Eckler will continue to have a very high receiving floor, even with Josh Palmer emerging and the return of Keenan Allen. At 4, Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey, I've talked about as the return of Elijah Mitchell has an impact on his upside. Usually he's a player that, regardless of matchup, is a great play. But now we have Elijah Mitchell, unfortunately, out for 6 to 8 weeks. Yet another injury for him. So that puts Christian McCaffrey back into his all-encompassing role. I doubt we're going to see much of any Jordan Mason or Tyrion Davis-Price. We're probably more likely to see Kyle Juszczyk than those two. So in a matchup with the Dolphins, who are a difficult one, 9th in fantasy points allowed, 5th in run defense grade, I still expect McCaffrey to be someone that will be able to put up numbers in this offense that runs the ball so efficiently. At 5, Derrick Henry. Henry going against the Eagles, who are 22nd in fantasy points allowed, or 21st in fantasy points allowed to running backs, and 24th in rushing DVOA. Look, even the additions of Linval Joseph and Ndamukong Suh haven't made a significant impact quite yet to being able to stop the running back position. We saw Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon find the end zone last week. At 6, rounding out the top 6, is Aaron Jones against Chicago. Chicago has been brutal against the run, 32nd in run defense grade and 27th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. Jones is the leader, and with the stat of Aaron Rodgers up in the air, we could see an even further amount of volume going to the run game. And potentially now, if Rodgers is in at QB, we could see this team finally start giving the ball to their backs inside the 5 and not relying as much on Jordan Love. But regardless, if Rodgers manages to play, he's going to be very banged up. Flipping over to the rest of the top 12, Jonathan Taylor at 7 going against the Cowboys. The Cowboys have been a very good run defense against opposing backs. A lot of that's because they haven't been allowing touchdowns. Less predictable stat, to be honest with you. They're 7th in fantasy points allowed, but 27th in run defense grade. I think that's really the biggest weakness of this Cowboys defense is against the run. And with Taylor, the Colts will be happy to do it because they cannot pass block worth of shit. That Alec Pierce play for me last night was just absolutely embarrassing. That's a factor of the Colts just can't pass block right now. And Matt Ryan did not look good early in that game either. So I expect Jonathan Taylor to be leaned on quite a bit against Dallas, who has a great pass rush and secondary. At 8, Travis Etienne. Usually I like to keep players out whose statuses are up in the air, but I have some confidence in Etienne playing this week, and I want to give you confidence to get him back in your lineup if he is playing. Detroit, 22nd in fantasy points allowed, 26th in rushing DVOA. So we've got a good matchup here for Etienne, who when he's back, will be that number one guy. We saw Hasty can't handle being involved as a feature back, so it won't expect that to change here. At 9, another vote of confidence from me on David Montgomery, this time against the Packers, who are dead last in rushing DVOA and 28th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. We saw another great week for Miles Sanders and Kenneth Gainwell. I don't think that's going to change here for David Montgomery, who's that solo RB in this offense, with really like Tristan Ebner probably is going to spell him if at all. So love Montgomery this week. At 10, Saquon Barkley going against Washington. Washington 6th in fantasy points allowed, 4th in rushing DVOA. This is a tough matchup for Barkley. But being the role that he has and how important he is to this offense, you can't really put him any farther than this. Otherwise, you're just kind of reaching and guessing. The volume still should be there. It's just going to be a tough matchup for him. So that's why I don't see him as, a top 8 back on the week. He's just narrowly in my top 10. At 11, Joe Mixon. I expect Mixon to be back coming off the concussion. That's what we typically see, 1 week off and then back into the lineup. And that probably won't change here. Kansas City proving to be like a middling run defense, 17th in run defense grade, 14th in fantasy points allowed to running back. So nothing to be scared of here with Mixon. Definitely get him back into the lineup. P. Ryan will just kind of go back to his role as the primary backup. At 12, Ramondre Stevenson, someone I was low on last week and definitely proved me wrong. Not a big week from Stevenson, was saved by his receiving upside, but man, Mac Jones loves to check the ball down to him. Absolutely loves it. So going against Buffalo this week on Thursday night, I don't expect that to change. But the Bills, 13th in fantasy points allowed, 3rd in DVOA. Against backs, so a tough matchup, but one that Stevenson should be able to handle. Damien Harris has just kind of settled into the background here of just getting a few touches here and there. At 13, Dameon Pierce. I mentioned it for the last 2 weeks. These were very tough matchups for Pierce. Unlikely to be able to get much return on him, but don't be scared to put him back into your lineup because we have the plus of plus matchups here against Cleveland, who are 31st in fantasy points allowed, 31st in DVOA. There's a very bad run defense from Cleveland. This is the way that the Texans will stay in this game, especially after the stinker that Kyle Allen put out this past week. So have confidence in playing Dameon Pierce this week. 14, Dalvin Cook. Cook going against the Jets. The Jets have been very good against the run this year. They've just been an incredible defense altogether. The Jets are 8th in fantasy points allowed and 6th in run defense grade. So a tough matchup for Cook. But again, this is one of those players, much like Barkley, where yes, tough matchups come, but that doesn't mean this guy can't play through that and put together a decent performance for you and be an RB2 on the week. It doesn't take a ton. It takes like 13 points to be an RB2, 14 points to be an RB2. At 15, Kenneth Walker. Walker running into a very tough matchup. Why I have him at 15 as opposed to having him at probably in most cases I'd have him at 19 in this kind of matchup is how bad the Rams are offensively. So that's going to give an opportunity for Seattle here to be leading in this game, to win this game. Positive game script, regardless of the tough matchup, should give Walker some volume. But again, the Rams are very good against opposing backs. Top 10 in fantasy points allowed and have the number 1 run defense grade. We saw Pacheco run for 2.8 yards a carry this past week. That probably is going to be not quite the case for Walker. He's a better back than Pacheco, but it's still going to be tough for him to be efficient and ultimately find the end zone. Now, I speak pretty negatively about him, but I still have him as a top 15 back, and that's as we move to Rachaad White, who's my RB16. A great week for White last week. Those receptions, the volume of just being a number 1 back for Tom Brady and not having anyone spell you is just incredibly valuable when you're a good pass catcher, and Rachaad White proved that. Going against the Saints, I expect Fournette to be out because missing last week coming off the bye is concerning. I expect this injury. It's a hip injury. It's probably going to linger. I'm not confident that he's going to be back this week if he missed last week. So a matchup with New Orleans for Rachaad White is still one I'm looking to play him in and still see him as a solid RB2 this week. 11th in fantasy points and 21st in rushing DVOA are the Saints. 17, Alvin Kamara. I mean, what do we fucking do with this guy? He's just absolutely terrible. One of the worst early round picks, I think, of the year. This offense is awful. I'm so tired of watching Andy Dalton. I'll be lying, actually. I don't watch the Saints play because they're incredibly boring. But they'll be in prime time, so we'll definitely be watching it. But but I need to see more from Kamara, both in the receiving game and just upside. And like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are 4th in fantasy points allowed, but they are 22nd in run defense grade. I do think the Saints could run the ball on them a little bit, but again, how high can I be in this guy when this offense just doesn't have scoring opportunities, right? So that makes it tough. At 18, Jamal Williams going against Jacksonville. I now have to settle in on the fact that the DeAndre Swift big season has no chance of happening. Even late in the year, I don't think it's happening. We're seeing Justin Jackson get carries and touches and run routes. We're seeing, obviously, Jamal Williams steal those most important touches in this offense. And in a plus matchup against Jacksonville, I see Williams as a pretty decent play this week, where the Jags are 16th in fantasy points allowed. Middling matchup, but one that obviously for Detroit could be a potential of winning. So I could give Williams some more carries. That's where his game is on the ground. At 19, Tony Pollard. We haven't talked about the Dallas running backs who have been absolutely electric the last couple of weeks, especially Pollard. But the Colts are a pretty good run defense, 8th in run defense grade, 17th in fantasy points allowed. But I don't expect this game to be very high scoring. So I do still like Pollard. But at the end of the day, this is a guy who splits touches and isn't even the clear RB1 in his offense. So it's hard to get him higher than this for this week in this matchup. So that's why I've got him at 19. At 20, Brian Robinson. Good matchup here for Washington. Giants 25th in fantasy points allowed, 28th in rushing DVOA, and Robinson is their favorite guy on the ground. No doubt about that. Player that they're looking to when they need to score, when they have those short yardages, when they have those plays on the goal line. So I have him elevated above Antonio Gibson, who we'll get to shortly. And then at 21, Gus Edwards. Going against Denver. Denver, their offense is absolutely terrible. There's just no situation here where Baltimore is going to have a game here where they're not going to either be leading or in a competitive matchup. The Broncos can't run away or take a lead against anybody. And Baltimore's been pretty good early in games. So I like Gus. Found the end zone last week. When he's healthy, they feed him the football. Denver 17th in rushing DVOA. This is definitely the bigger weakness of their defense. We saw Deonta Foreman and Chuba Hubbard have a pretty solid week last week as well. At 22, Devin Singletary against the Patriots. The Patriots are really good defensively, both against the pass and the run. 2nd in fantasy points allowed to running backs. Singletary's usage as a receiver is great, elevates him, it saves his floor here in a tough matchup. So that's why I have him as a back-end RB2. 23, Ezekiel Elliott. I mentioned Pollard. For Zeke, same matchup here, but I do see Pollard as the more efficient guy. He's been better lately. His role is growing. Still see Zeke as somebody I want to play because I do expect the Cowboys to be leading this game most of the way. So I still like him, but just not to a really, really high degree against a tough defense to be able to score on. 24. A lot of questions the last couple of weeks about Kareem Hunt. I saw it in the waiver wire video, somebody asking if they could drop him. No dropping Kareem Hunt. Do not drop Kareem Hunt. I know we haven't had any reason to play him. Here's the week. Houston, 32nd in fantasy points allowed to running backs. We get Deshaun Watson back. We get some improvement to this passing game, and we could see Hunt be a massive beneficiary of that. Obviously, the emergence of Donovan Peoples-Jones this year has definitely hindered Hunt's upside as a receiver, but I do like him in this matchup where he could run the ball efficiently, and with a better passing game from Deshaun Watson, we could see Hunt be a valuable play. Nothing crazy, like an RB2 is where I have him back in RB2, but I do want to play him over some of these guys that we'll get to, which is next up, Jeff Wilson. Wilson at 25. I'm not so sure how long Mostert's injury is going to linger. I don't have him ranked right now because I don't expect him to play. But regardless, this is a very tough matchup for Miami's running game. I expect them to pass the ball at a really, really high rate in what will finally be a game where I expect things to be competitive. They've been blowing teams out lately, and that's been very much a benefit to Wilson. But San Francisco, 1st in fantasy points allowed to running backs and 4th in run defense grade. So it's a tough matchup for Wilson. That's why I have him outside of an RB2 this week. At 26, Antonio Gibson. I mentioned the Giants being a good matchup in terms of fantasy points allowed and their run defense grade, but they do allow the least receptions to running backs on the season. I think there's something to that, and Gibson's role and his value comes from the receiving game and being able to give you some points in your PPR leagues and half PPR leagues. I think that's a problem here against the Giants. That's why I have him outside of the top 24 and more of a flex option this week. But there definitely probably are some receivers I'd rather play over him, especially if you're in a PPR league. Kyren Williams at 27. I talked about Kyren Williams in the waiver wire video. Some people just thought it was silly. I understand that this offense might not be very efficient, But these are really plus matchups for Kyren Williams in the running game. And honestly, a couple of them are going to be competitive. Like, this team is coached very well by Sean McVay. There's going to be some games here, I think, late in the season that they win that you probably don't expect them to. It's the NFL. That happens all the time. I had someone clowning me because I said the Jags were going to cover last week. So I do think that Kyren Williams in a matchup against Seattle is one you want to play. They're 29th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. They're giving up a ton of fantasy points to backs. We saw Josh Jacobs go off last week. Williams is the leader for this backfield. You can play Kyren Williams here. I really do think that. At 28, A.J. Dillon. I mentioned this a plus matchup for the Packers, but Dillon's been incredibly frustrating in this offense. I know he found the end zone last week. He's still a very risky play in my mind. Jones is the primary guy. He's been getting more of the receiving work, and I can't trust Dillon right now. He looks slow too. Even on that touchdown, I thought he looked very slow. So I'd rather be going to Aaron Jones. You could still play Dillon. That's why I have him in my top 30, but I just want to temper expectations, even though it's a really good matchup. At 29, Benny Snell. Now, I want to make sure I note this. If Najee Harris is healthy, he had an ab injury, and I've seen this year a few different players have abdominal injuries and then not play that week. I saw it with Hardman, and there was two others that I can't remember. Hardman is the biggest one I remember. So I just think that if Najee does play, which he very well could, but it's Tuesday here when we're getting this out to you guys. If he does play, I definitely have Harris as like probably my RB 17 in front of Alvin Kamara is where I'd probably see him. But with Benny Snell, he was the leader in snaps and touches ahead of Anthony McFarland. Obviously, there's a potential of Jalen Warren coming back, but he has a hamstring injury. So that's a question mark. But I think if Snell and McFarland are the lead backs, this is a pretty good matchup. The Falcons, 25th in rushing DVOA, 23rd in fantasy points allowed. You could play Benny Snell. But again, even in the plus matchup, there's a split. He's got to find the end zone to really return you value. Can he do that? That's the question mark for me there. So that's why I have him as, a flex option again this week. At 30, Cordarrelle Patterson. This is with TJ Watt back, everything the Steelers have given us defensively without him is nowhere near what they are with him on the field. They are so much better defensively and so much better of a team with him on the field and available. So that elevates their defense. And Patterson is still splitting touches with Tyler Algier. This is a game where they could potentially be leading, potentially lean on the run game a little bit more. But the Steelers are 8th in rushing DVOA, 19th in fantasy points allowed. So I kind of see this as a pretty middling to maybe even not a great matchup for them on the ground. And that's why I have Cordarrelle in this back end right now. All right, that's the top 30. A couple guys that missed. 31, Miles Sanders. Tennessee, man, the Titans are such a good run defense. The only thing they're doing is giving up receptions to running backs. I think they're dead last now in receptions allowed to backs. But the Eagles are not targeting their backs a lot, and that's because of Jalen Hurts' rushing ability. And any mobile quarterback, you look at their numbers and they just target running backs less. That's just the case, and that's the case for Jalen Hurts. So I'm very low on Sanders this week. He's like my number one guy I'm telling you not to start. Pacheco is in at 32. A matchup with the Bengals. Look, when Pacheco doesn't have a game where this team is in a really positive game script, they're on the road in Cincinnati, all he gives you is the potential to score, because if he runs for 60, 70 yards, that's not worth a lot to you. It's worth 7 fantasy points. He's not running routes as a receiver. That's why I'm low on him. A few others, Latavius Murray against Baltimore. I think this Denver team is not going to be in very many scenarios where they can safely run the ball, and Baltimore's run defense is really starting to improve. Zonovan Knight, who I mentioned as a priority waiver ad against Minnesota, he's my RB 35. It's a very tough matchup for them on the ground, so I think the Jets are going to struggle a little bit on the ground, lean a bit more on the pass game, and Knight could still be involved there. He had like 3 receptions, but he'll split that with Ty Johnson, so that's why I see his floor a little bit lower. Same with DeAndre Swift, who I mentioned earlier. It's my RB 33. Just can't trust him, man. Volume's not there. He's not getting valuable touches. I can't trust him. So that is the top 30 running backs for the week. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel. Really, really appreciate it. And of course, if you love the show, if you love the channel, go check out our partners over at Betfred. Let them know we sent you by clicking the link down below to go sign up. Bet 50, you're going to get $250 from Betfred. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.